Hey guys, tonight we slip into the buzzing, smoky workshops of the 1920s where dreamers and tinkerers churn out inventions faster than you can say flapper dress. Picture yourself in a cluttered garage, oil lamps flickering, gears and wires strewn across a workbench. The air hums with ambition. Everyone's chasing the next big thing, from talking machines to flying cars. You're surrounded by optimistic blueprints, half-built gadgets, and the faint whiff of burnt solder. It's the Roaring Twenties, and innovation's the name of the game. But here's the kicker. Most of these gizmos, you probably wouldn't survive their maiden voyage. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your location and local time. I'm curious where you're drifting off from tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in 1920, and the world feels electric. The Great War's over, jazz is spilling out of speakeasies, and inventors are riding a wave of post-war optimism. Factories are churning, cities are growing, and everyone's got a wild idea to make life faster, fancier, or just plain weirder. This is the decade that gave us the radio, the traffic light, and sliced bread. Yep, that was a big deal back then. But for every success, there's a pile of forgotten contraptions that never made it past the drawing board. Tonight, we're diving into those flops, the quirky, ambitious inventions that promised to change the world, but ended up collecting dust. Let's start with the vibe of the era. You're walking through a bustling city, maybe New York or Chicago, where skyscrapers are shooting up and Model T Fords honk through crowded streets. Inventors, often just regular folks with big dreams, are sketching ideas in cramped apartments or borrowed barns. The 1920s saw a patent boom. Over 600,000 patents were filed in the U.S. alone. That's a lot of brain power, but not every idea was a winner. Some were downright bizarre, like the electric rejuvenator that promised to zap you back to youth. Spoiler, it didn't. You'd plug it in, feel a tingle, and maybe regret your life choices. Now, picture yourself flipping through a 1920s magazine. Glossy ads for vacuum cleaners and toasters, but also weirder stuff. One quirky tidbit, inventors were obsessed with vibration therapy. They thought shaking your body with mechanical belts could cure everything from headaches to laziness. You'd strap into a vibrating chair, looking like you're auditioning for a silent film comedy, only to find it did nothing but rattle your bones. Historians still argue whether these devices were pure quackery or just overly optimistic science. Most lean toward quackery, but the debate keeps things lively at academic conferences. You're probably wondering why so many of these ideas even got off the ground. Well, the 1920s were a time of anything's possible. Electricity was still newish, and people thought it could do anything. Light your house, power your car, maybe even make you immortal. You'd see inventors at fairs proudly showing off machines that looked impressive but broke down by lunch. One guy, let's call him Fred, might have spent his life savings on a self-cooking pot that just burned soup. Fred's not laughing, but we can, because time softened the blow. As you wander through this era, you notice the sheer variety of inventions. Some aim to make housework easier, others to make travel faster, and a few just wanted to make you laugh or cry, depending on the results. The 1920s were a playground for dreamers, and every failed gadget tells a story of hope, hustle, and a touch of absurdity. So settle in as we head toward one of the decade's biggest obsessions, the radio. Not the sleek sets you're thinking of, but the clunky, hissing prototypes that started it all. You're crouched in a dimly lit parlor, fiddling with a wooden box the size of a suitcase. It's 1922, and this is a radio, or at least someone's optimistic attempt at one. The thing crackles like a campfire, spitting static as you twist its oversized dials. Wires snake across the floor, and the whole setup looks like it might zap you if you sneeze. Welcome to the early days of radio, where the dream of instant entertainment was born, but the reality was a lot less tuneful. Most of these early sets were more science experiment than hi-fi, and plenty never made it past the prototype stage. You're about to find out why. The 1920s were when radio started to change the world. By 1925, over 5 million U.S. households had a radio, pulling voices and music out of the air like magic. But before that, you're dealing with machines that were finicky at best. You'd spend hours adjusting a cat's whisker, a thin wire touching a crystal to catch signals. Get it wrong, and you're listening to static, or worse, your neighbor's amateur broadcast about his prize-winning hogs. The mainstream fact here is that radio broadcasting officially kicked off in 1920 with stations like KDKA in Pittsburgh, beaming news and music to anyone with a receiver. But the quirky tidbit? Early radios often caught fire. Yep, you'd be enjoying a jazz tune when, poof, your set starts smoking like it's auditioning for a vaudeville act. The 1920s were when radio started to change the world. By 1925, over 5 million U.S. households had a radio, pulling voices and music out of the air like magic. But before that, you're dealing with machines that were finicky at best. You'd spend hours adjusting a cat's whisker, a thin wire touching a crystal to catch signals. Get it wrong, and you're listening to static, or worse, your neighbor's amateur broadcast about his prize-winning hogs. The mainstream fact here is that radio broadcasting officially kicked off in 1920 with stations like KDKA in Pittsburgh, beaming news and music to anyone with a receiver. But the quirky tidbit? Early radios often caught fire. Yep, you'd be enjoying a jazz tune when, poof, your set starts smoking like it's auditioning for a vaudeville act. You're twisting those dials, trying to pick up a signal, and it's not going well. Some early radios, like the 1921 Grebe CR6, promised crystal clear sound, but delivered mostly hisses and pops. Inventors thought they could make radios portable too. Picture yourself lugging a 20-pound portable radio to a picnic, only to find the batteries died before you got through one song. Historians still argue whether these early failures were due to bad engineering or just overeager marketing. The truth probably lies in both. Engineers were learning on the fly, and companies were quick to slap a price tag on anything that sparked. Now, imagine you're at a radio shop, shelves lined with gleaming wooden boxes, each promising to be the future. You spot one called the Radiola Super Heterodyne. Sounds fancy, right? It was for 1924, but it cost as much as a used car, about $400 or over $6,000 today. Most folks couldn't afford it, and cheaper knockoffs often didn't work. You'd tune in expecting Caruso and get what sounded like a cat fighting a typewriter. No wonder so many early models ended up as doorstops. Here's a little chuckle for you. Some inventors tried selling radio hats. Yes, hats with built-in receivers. You'd walk around looking like a human antenna, and good luck getting a signal in a breeze. As you tinker with your set, you're struck by the optimism of it all. Radio was supposed to connect the world, and it did, eventually. But in the early 1920s, it was a gamble. You might spend a week's wages on a box that only worked when the stars aligned. Call back to that invention boom we talked about. Radio was the poster child, but its clunky cousins didn't survive the decade. You're starting to see the pattern. Big ideas, shaky execution. And speaking of shaky, let's move to something even wilder. You're about to climb into a contraption that promised to soar above the city. A flying car that never quite took off. You're strapped into a rickety contraption that looks like a Model T Ford got frisky with a biplane. It's 1923, and you're on a dusty field outside Detroit, staring at what someone optimistically calls a flying car. The engine sputters, the wings, yes, wings, wobble, and you're pretty sure this thing won't survive takeoff. Welcome to the 1920s dream of flying cars, where inventors thought they could blend automobiles and airplanes into one glorious skybound future. Spoiler, you're not soaring anywhere tonight. Most of these hybrids crashed, metaphorically and literally, into the scrap heap of history. The 1920s were wild for transportation innovation. The mainstream fact is that automobiles were booming. By 1927, over 15 million Model Ts were on U.S. roads, making cars a household staple. But some dreamers looked to the skies, inspired by World War I aviation. Enter the quirky tidbit. One such flying car, the 1921 Tampier Avion automobile, was a French monstrosity with foldable wings and a car chassis. You drive to a field, unfold the wings, and pray. Tests showed it could fly a few feet before wobbling back to Earth, hardly the stuff of Buck Rogers. Historians still argue whether these early attempts were bold engineering or just delusional optimism. The smart money's on delusion, but the ambition was real. Picture yourself in the driver's seat, gripping a steering wheel that doubles as a flight yoke. The dashboard is a mess of levers and gauges, half for driving, half for flying, and none labeled clearly. You rev the engine, and it roars like an angry lawnmower. The idea was simple: drive to work, fly over traffic, land at the office. But in practice, you're lucky if the thing rolls without catching fire. One test pilot, let's call him Brave Bob, tried a similar model, the 1922 Curtiss autoplane. It hopped a few yards, then nosedived into a ditch. Bob walked away, but the dream didn't. Here's a chuckle. Some ads claim these cars could park in the clouds. Sure, if by park they meant plummet. You're bouncing along in this contraption, feeling every bolt rattle. The 1920s were full of these half-baked ideas, fueled by a post-war belief that technology could do anything. You can almost hear the inventors pitching to investors. It's a car, it's a plane, it's probably not safe. The Tampier and its kin never made it to market. Too heavy to fly, too flimsy to drive. You're starting to see why radio, for all its static, was a safer bet. Call back to that buzzing workshop from earlier. These flying car folks were in the same garages, dreaming just as big, crashing just as hard. As you climb out of this winged jalopy, dusting off your goggles, you're struck by the sheer audacity. These inventors weren't just tinkering, they were trying to rewrite how you move through the world. But gravity's a tough critic, and most of these flying cars stayed grounded. Now, let's shift gears, literally, and step into a 1920s doctor's office where the health gadgets are even weirder than this. Brace yourself for some truly bizarre cures. You're sitting in a 1920s doctor's office, the kind with creaky wooden floors and a faint whiff of antiseptic. A mustachioed physician hands you a contraption that looks like a cross between a bicycle pump and a hairdryer. It's buzzing faintly, and he swears it'll cure your insomnia, or maybe your bad attitude. Welcome to the wild world of 1920s health gadgets, where inventors promised miracles but delivered mostly sparks and disappointment. You're about to strap on some truly bizarre devices that never caught on, and trust me, you're not feeling rejuvenated anytime soon. The 1920s were a golden age for medical quackery. A mainstream fact, this decade saw the rise of legitimate medical advances, like insulin for diabetes, discovered in 1921. But alongside those breakthroughs, a quirky tidbit emerges. Inventors flooded the market with electrotherapy devices, claiming electricity could fix anything from baldness to nervous exhaustion. Take the violet ray machine, a popular 1920s gadget. You'd plug it in, attach a glass wand, and zap yourself with purple sparks. Supposedly, it boosted your vitality. In reality, you'd get a mild shock and a weird glow, more carnival trick than cure. Historians still argue whether these devices were outright scams or products of misguided optimism. The debate's murky, but the burns were real. You're holding the violet ray now, its wand humming like an angry bee. The doctor's telling you to rub it on your scalp for hair vigor. You give it a go, and your hair stands on end, making you look like you've been struck by lightning. The instruction manual, yes, it came with one, promises youthful energy in 10 minutes daily. 10 minutes later, you're just mildly annoyed and still bald. Here's a little chuckle. Some models had attachments for, private vitality. You'd zap places best left unzapped, and let's just say the results weren't exactly electrifying. Now, picture yourself browsing a 1920s mail-order catalog. Pages crammed with health gadgets. There's the Thermalade, a heated belt you'd wrap around your stomach to melt fat. Spoiler, it didn't. You'd sweat buckets, maybe faint, but your waistline stayed the same. These devices thrived on the era's obsession with quick fixes, much like those flying cars we left in the dust. Call back to that 1920s invention boom. Same energy here, just with more questionable medical advice. You're starting to notice a pattern. Big promises, shaky results, and a lot of folks hoping to cash in. As you set down the violet ray, the doctor's already pitching another gadget, a magnetic corset, to align your energies. You politely decline, feeling like you've dodged a bullet. These health devices were everywhere, sold in drugstores and advertised in magazines with smiling models who clearly never used them. The 1920s loved its tech, but not every spark led to a fire. Now, let's step out of this questionable clinic and into a 1920s film studio, where the gadgets are just as odd, but a bit more glamorous. You're stumbling through a 1920s film studio where the air smells of hot lamps and sawdust. A director in a beret is shouting at a crew wrestling with a machine that looks like a giant typewriter married a bicycle. It's supposed to revolutionize movie making, but right now, it's just spitting gears. Welcome to the chaotic world of silent film tech, where inventors dreamed up gadgets to make pictures move smoother, sound better, or just dazzle audiences. Most of these contraptions, though, never made it past the cutting room floor. You're about to tinker with some real flops. The 1920s were the peak of silent cinema, a mainstream fact. By 1925, Hollywood was churning out over 800 films a year, drawing millions to theaters. But behind the glamour, inventors were scrambling to improve the tech. Here's the quirky tidbit. One forgotten device, the kinetophone, was Thomas Edison's 1920s attempt to sync sound with film. You'd crank a phonograph while a projector ran, hoping the audio matched the actor's lips. Spoiler, it didn't. The needle skipped, the film jammed, and you'd get Charlie Chaplin's pratfalls paired with a garbled opera. Historians still argue whether the kinetophone failed because of clunky mechanics or because audiences just weren't ready for talkies. The jazzier Vitaphone system won out later, but that's another story. You're fiddling with the kinetophone now, trying to align the phonograph with a flickering reel of a cowboy flick. The needle scratches, and instead of gunshots, you hear a violin screech. The director's yelling, the crew sweating, and you're wondering if silent films were fine as they were. Here's a chuckle. Some studios hired sound effects men to bang coconuts for horse hooves during kinetophone tests. Imagine you're that guy, coconuts in hand, trying to keep up with a galloping scene while a machine eats the record. Picture yourself wandering the studio lot, dodging props and tripping over cables. You spot another oddity, the automatic scene shifter, a 1923 contraption meant to slide stage backdrops with pulleys and motors. Sounds clever, but it was a nightmare. You'd pull a lever, and instead of a smooth transition to a city skyline, the backdrop would crash, or worse, trap an actor mid-scene. One poor actress, let's call her Mabel, got stuck in a forest backdrop for half a take, waving like she was drowning in canvas. Call back to those 1920s health gadgets we zapped ourselves with. Same overzealous spirit here, just with more dramatic flair. As you abandon the kinetophone, you're struck by the hustle of it all. Silent films were magic, but the tech behind them was often a mess. Inventors kept pushing though, dreaming of synchronized sound or seamless sets. Most of these gadgets faded as talkies took over by 1929, but they paved the way, even if they tripped over their own wires. Now, let's leave the studio's chaos and step into a clanking, whirring future, one where robots were born, but didn't quite walk. You're in a smoky 1920s exhibition hall, surrounded by gawking crowds and the clatter of metal. Before you stands a hulking contraption that looks like a tin can with arms, its gears grinding as it tries to wave. This is a robot, or so the inventor claims, and it's supposed to be the future of work. Maybe even your new butler. It's 1927 and the robot craze is sparking imaginations, but these early mechanical men are more likely to fall over than fetch your slippers. You're about to meet the clunkiest flops of the decade. The 1920s were buzzing with futuristic dreams, and robots were a shiny new obsession. A mainstream fact, the term robot was coined in 1920 by Czech playwright Karl Čapek in his play R.U.R., sparking a global fascination with mechanical beings. But here's the quirky tidbit. One of the first robots to capture public attention was Televox, unveiled in 1927 by Westinghouse. It wasn't much more than a box with relays that could flip switches via telephone signals. You'd call it, and Televox might turn on a light. Or it might just hum ominously and scare your cat. Historians still argue whether Televox was a genuine step toward automation or just a publicity stunt. Most lean toward stunt, but the crowds ate it up. You're standing in front of Televox now, watching it attempt to answer a phone. The inventor's sweating, flipping switches, while the crowd murmurs. You hear a click, then a whir, and Televox lifts a shaky arm, then freezes. The audience claps anyway because, well, it's the 1920s, and anything mechanical feels like magic. Here's a chuckle. The press called Televox a mechanical servant, but it took 3 engineers to make it do anything. You're picturing yourself trying to get this thing to brew your morning coffee. Good luck. It's more likely to tip the pot over. Now imagine you're at a science fair, weaving through booths of whirring gadgets. There's another robot, Eric, built in 1928 in Britain. Eric could stand, bow, and even speak via pre-recorded phrases, but it was all smoke and mirrors, literally. Its voice came from a hidden gramophone, and its movements were jerky, like a puppet with half its strings cut. You try to shake Eric's hand, but its claw nearly takes your finger off. Call back to those flying cars we left grounded. Same story here. Big ideas, wobbly execution. The 1920s loved dreaming of robots, but the tech wasn't ready to walk the talk. As you step away from Televox's clanking display, you're struck by the optimism. These early robots weren't practical, but they fired up imaginations, promising a world where machines did the heavy lifting. Most ended up in storage, their gears rusting as better tech came along. Now, let's trade the exhibition hall for a cozy 1920s kitchen, where electric appliances are sparking hope and a few too many literal sparks. You're standing in a 1920s kitchen, the kind with checkered floors and a single light bulb dangling overhead. On the counter sits a gleaming contraption that promises to make your life easier. An electric appliance straight out of a Sears catalog. It's got dials, a cord thicker than your thumb, and a name like Electro Chef. You plug it in and it hums like a swarm of bees, but you're not sure if it's cooking dinner or plotting revenge. Welcome to the world of 1920s electric home gadgets, where inventors dreamed of automating housework but often delivered sparks and frustration instead. The 1920s saw electricity transform homes. A mainstream fact, by 1929, about 70% of U.S. urban households had electricity, powering new appliances like toasters and vacuum cleaners. But alongside the winners, there were flops galore. Here's the quirky tidbit. One such dud was the electric dish dryer, a 1924 invention that promised to dry your plates with a blast of hot air. You'd stack your dishes inside, flip a switch, and wait. Problem was, it often scorched the plates or blew them across the room like ceramic frisbees. Historians still argue whether these devices failed because of shoddy design or because housewives just preferred air drying. The evidence points to both, plus a healthy dose of skepticism about labor-saving hype. You're fiddling with the electric dish dryer now, stacking your best china with cautious optimism. You hit the switch and a gust of hot air roars out, rattling the dishes like a poltergeist on a budget. One plate wobbles, then cracks. You're starting to see why this didn't catch on. Here's a chuckle. The manual suggested using it to warm your kitchen in winter. Sure, if you wanted a kitchen sauna with a side of broken crockery. You're half expecting it to launch your teacup into the next county. Picture yourself flipping through a 1920s home magazine, ads promising a push-button paradise. There's another flop, the electric laundry mangler, meant to iron clothes with heated rollers. Sounds great, but you'd feed in a shirt and get back a singed rag, or nothing if the roller's jammed. You try it and the machine groans like it's lifting weights. Your shirt's now a crumpled, smoky mess. Call back to those clunky robots we met. Same overzealous spirit, same tendency to overpromise. The 1920s were all about electrifying the home, but some ideas were better left unplugged. As you unplug the dish dryer, dodging a puff of suspiciously burnt-smelling air, you're struck by the era's enthusiasm. Inventors saw electricity as a magic wand, but not every wave worked. These gadgets were sold with starry-eyed ads, yet most ended up in attics, their cords frayed and dreams dimmed. Now, let's stay in the kitchen, but shift to something tastier. Some truly odd food machines that promised culinary miracles but delivered chaos. You're still in that 1920s kitchen, the linoleum cool under your feet, as you eye a contraption that looks like a cross between a sewing machine and a meat grinder. It's called the Auto Chef, and it's supposed to whip up dinner faster than you can say Charleston. You turn a crank, and it clanks like a tin band tuning up, promising to knead dough, churn butter, or maybe just ruin your evening. Welcome to the quirky world of 1920s food machines, where inventors tried to revolutionize cooking but often served up chaos instead of cuisine. These gadgets were meant to make your kitchen a futuristic wonder, but most ended up as cupboard clutter. The 1920s were a time when convenience became king. A mainstream fact, canned foods and electric appliances like the pop-up toaster invented in 1921 started reshaping how people cooked. But then there's the quirky tidbit. Some inventors went overboard with machines like the automatic pie maker, a 1926 device that promised perfect pies every time. You'd load it with dough and filling, press a button, and hope. Usually you'd get a soggy mess or a pie that looked like it had been sat on. Historians still argue whether these flops failed because of overcomplicated mechanics or because home cooks preferred their own recipes. The truth's probably a mix. Fancy gadgets couldn't beat Grandma's rolling pin. You're cranking the Auto Chef now, watching it churn with a noise like a Model T backfiring. You're aiming for biscuits, but the dough's oozing out the sides, and the machine's shaking like it's possessed. The manual swears it can knead, mix, and bake, but you're pretty sure it's just needing your patience. Here's a chuckle. Some ads claimed it could replace the housewife. Imagine telling that to your aunt, who'd probably whack the thing with a ladle and go back to her stove. You're starting to suspect this machine's better at making noise than dinner. Picture yourself at a 1920s home show, booths packed with shiny kitchen gadgets. There's another flop, the electric soup strainer, meant to puree your soup into silky perfection. You pour in your vegetable broth, flip the switch, and it either clogs or sprays soup like a lawn sprinkler. You're dodging splatters, wondering who thought this was easier than a spoon and a sieve. Call back to that electric dish dryer we wrestled with. Same story here. Big promises, messy results. The 1920s kitchen was a battleground of ambition, where inventors tried to outsmart centuries of culinary know-how with motors and gears. As you scrape dough off the Auto Chef's blades, you're struck by the era's relentless optimism. These machines were sold with glossy ads showing smiling families around perfect meals, but the reality was more like a comedy of errors. Most of these gadgets ended up in basements, their motors burnt out and their dreams of domestic bliss forgotten. Now let's step out of the kitchen and slip into something a little more personal, some truly bizarre wearable tech that the 1920s thought you'd love. You're standing in a 1920s department store, surrounded by mannequins draped in flapper dresses and fedoras, but your eyes are on a peculiar accessory, a clunky belt with wires dangling like a bad costume prop. It's labeled the Vitaradian, and the salesman swears it'll boost your energy just by wearing it. You buckle it on, feeling like you're auditioning for a sci-fi serial, but it's doing nothing except pinching your waist. Welcome to the odd world of 1920s wearable tech, where inventors dreamed of gadgets you could strap on to become healthier, smarter, or just cooler. Most of these, though, ended up in the bargain bin faster than you can say jazz age. The 1920s were all about personal flair, with fashion and tech colliding in bold ways. A mainstream fact, the decade saw the rise of wristwatches, with sales booming as they became affordable. Over 2 million sold in the US by 1929. But then there's the quirky tidbit. Inventors pushed wearable health devices like the radioactive pad, a 1925 gadget you'd tie around your arm or leg. It was stuffed with low-grade radioactive material, supposedly to stimulate vitality. Spoiler, it didn't. You'd wear it, feel nothing, and maybe glow faintly in the dark. Historians still argue whether these pads were dangerous quackery or just harmless nonsense. Most say they were a bit of both, but the radium craze was real. You're adjusting the Vitaradian now, its metal clasp cold against your skin. The salesman's pitching it as a scientific marvel, claiming it sends vital rays into your body. You're skeptical, especially since the thing weighs as much as a small dog and makes your trousers sag. Here's a chuckle. The manual suggests wearing it to bed for restful vigor. Sure, if you call tossing and turning under a 5-pound belt restful, you're half expecting it to spark and ruin your best shirt. Picture yourself flipping through a 1920s catalog, pages boasting wearable tech like the electric hairbrush meant to stimulate your scalp for luscious locks. You brush your hair, and it hums, sending tiny shocks that make your scalp tingle and your hair frizz like a startled cat. It's less Hollywood star and more mad scientist. Call back to that auto chef we battled in the kitchen. Same overblown promises here, just strapped to your body instead of your counter. The 1920s loved the idea of tech enhancing you, but these wearables were more hassle than help. As you unbuckle the Vitaradian, relieved to be free of its weight, you're struck by the era's wild optimism. Inventors thought they could zap, vibrate, or radiate you into a better version of yourself, but most of these gadgets were impractical or just plain weird. They faded fast, overshadowed by simpler accessories like watches. Now let's leave the department store and hop into something more adventurous, some 1920s travel ideas that promised to take you places, but mostly went nowhere. You're perched in a wobbly seat, gripping a lever in a contraption that looks like a rowboat strapped to a bicycle frame. It's 1926, and some wide-eyed inventor is calling this the pedal glider, a personal transport device meant to let you soar over city streets or pedal through them. The thing creaks ominously, and you're pretty sure it's not going anywhere but down. Welcome to the 1920s futuristic travel dreams, where inventors cooked up wild ideas to revolutionize how you get around. Most of these, like the pedal glider, crashed before they could fly, figuratively and sometimes very literally. The 1920s were a boom time for transport innovation. A mainstream fact, commercial aviation took off, with the first U.S. airmail service starting in 1920, paving the way for passenger flights. But then there's the quirky tidbit. Inventors were obsessed with hybrid vehicles like the autogyro, a 1923 contraption that combined a car chassis with a helicopter-like rotor. You drive along, spin the rotor, and, supposedly, lift off for a short hop. In reality, it barely got off the ground, wobbling like a drunk kite before landing with a thud. Historians still argue whether these hybrids failed due to underpowered engines or just impractical designs. The consensus leans toward both, plus a sprinkle of overambition. You're pedaling the pedal glider now, sweat beading as the rotor above you spins sluggishly. The inventor's shouting instructions, pedal harder, but you're barely inching forward, let alone flying. The whole setup feels like a gym workout gone wrong, and you're wondering why you didn't just take the bus. Here's a chuckle. The Autogyro sales pitch promised traffic-free travel. Sure, if you count crashing into a field as avoiding traffic. You're starting to think these inventors spent more time dreaming than testing. Picture yourself at a 1920s transport expo, surrounded by gleaming prototypes. There's another flop, the mono wheel, a giant wheel you'd sit inside, pedaling like a hamster to roll down the street. It sounded thrilling, but steering was a nightmare. You'd wobble, spin, and pray not to tip over. You give it a try, and within seconds, you're dizzy, rolling toward a fence. Call back to that Vita Radian belt we wrestled with. Same bold promises here, just with more bruises. The 1920s were all about pushing boundaries, but these travel gadgets pushed physics a bit too far. As you climb out of the pedal glider, legs wobbly and pride-dented, you're struck by the era's relentless hope. These inventors saw a future where you could zip through the air or roll in style, but their machines couldn't keep up. Most ended up as curiosities in trade magazines, forgotten as cars and planes took over. Now, let's trade travel for vanity and step into a 1920s beauty parlor where the gadgets are just as wild but a lot more glamorous. You're seated in a 1920s beauty parlor, the air thick with the scent of lavender pomade and singed hair. A stylist, all bobs and beads, is waving a contraption that looks like a curling iron crossed with a medieval torture device. It's the PermaWave machine, and it promises to give you perfect curls that last for weeks. You lean back, the chair creaking as the device hums ominously near your scalp. Welcome to the bizarre world of 1920s beauty gadgets, where inventors tried to make you glamorous with machines that often left you frazzled instead. These devices were meant to be the future of chic, but most curled up and died in obscurity. The 1920s were a golden age for personal style, with flapper culture redefining beauty. A mainstream fact, the decade saw the rise of commercial cosmetics, with brands like Max Factor selling over $1 million in makeup by 1929. But then there's the quirky tidbit. Inventors pushed devices like the Electro Beauty Cap, a 1925 helmet-like gadget that claimed to stimulate your face with mild electric currents for a youthful glow. You'd strap it on, flip a switch, and feel a tingle, along with mild panic as it buzzed like a trapped wasp. Historians still argue whether these beauty tools were pure quackery or just overzealous attempts at science. Most agree they were closer to snake oil than skincare. You're trying the PermaWave machine now, its metal rods clamped around your hair like an overzealous octopus. The stylist assures you it's perfectly safe, but the faint smell of burning makes you doubt her. The process takes hours and your scalp's prickling, less Hollywood starlet, more accidental electrician. Here's a chuckle. The manual suggested using it at home for quick touch-ups. Sure, if you call a 3-hour ordeal with a chance of baldness a touch-up. You're half expecting to walk out looking like a poodle caught in a storm. Picture yourself browsing a 1920s women's magazine, ads touting gadgets like the Vibration Face Massager, a handheld device that promised to smooth wrinkles by shaking your skin. You try it, and it feels like your face is auditioning for a jitterbug contest. The results? Your cheeks are red, but not in that dewy, youthful way. Call back to that pedal glider we wobbled in. Same story here. Big dreams, shaky execution. The 1920s loved the idea of mechanizing beauty, but these gadgets often left users more frustrated than fabulous. As you escape the permawave's clutches, your hair a mix of curls and frizz, you're struck by the era's obsession with instant glamour. These beauty tools were sold with promises of effortless elegance, but most delivered scorched hair or shocked faces. They faded fast, replaced by simpler combs and creams. Now let's leave the salon and tune into something grainier, the early, clunky attempts at television that flickered out fast. You're squinting at a tiny, flickering screen in a 1920s lab, the room lit by the dim glow of vacuum tubes. The device in front of you is a jumble of wires and glass, humming like a tired bumblebee, and it's supposed to be a television. The image, if you can call it that, is a blurry mess of lines and shadows, maybe a spinning disc or someone's hand waving. Welcome to the grainy, clunky world of 1920s television prototypes, where inventors chase the dream of moving pictures in your home. Most of these early sets, though, were more science experiment than entertainment, and they flickered out faster than a bad vaudeville act. The 1920s were laying the groundwork for modern media. A mainstream fact, while radio dominated, television was born with John Logie Baird's 1925 demonstration in London, transmitting a crude image of a ventriloquist dummy. But here's the quirky tidbit. Baird's televisor and its rivals, like Charles Francis Jenkins' Radiovision, were mechanical monstrosities. They used spinning discs with holes to scan images, producing grainy, 30-line pictures you'd strain to recognize. You'd sit inches from the screen, watching a blurry face flicker, only for the disc to jam or the motor to overheat. Historians still argue whether these early TVs failed because of crude tech or because audiences weren't ready to squint at home. The tech was the bitter culprit. Those discs were no match for later electronic systems. You're fiddling with a televisor now, its wooden cabinet creaking as you adjust the dial. The spinning disc whirs like a fan, and you're trying to make out a test image, a cardboard cutout of a face. It's less cinematic masterpiece and more ghostly smudge. You tweak a knob and the image warps, then vanishes. Here's a chuckle. Baird once boasted his TV could show live boxing matches. Imagine squinting at a 2-inch screen to see two blurry blobs slug it out. Hardly ringside thrills. You're starting to think a radio, static and all, was a better deal. Picture yourself at a 1920s tech demo, surrounded by goggle-eyed spectators. There's another flop, the phonovision, an attempt to record TV signals on wax discs. You'd play the disc hoping to re-watch a broadcast, but the result was a stuttering mess, like a film reel chewed by a dog. You try it, and the disc skips, turning a newsreader into a glitchy marionette. Call back to that permawave machine we escaped. Same overambitious vibe here, just with more static. The 1920s dreamed of TV as the next big thing, but these prototypes were too clunky to compete with radio's charm. As you step away from the televisor, rubbing your eyes from the strain, you're struck by the era's relentless vision. These inventors saw a future where moving images filled every home, but their machines couldn't deliver. Most ended up as museum curiosities, their discs stilled by better tech. Now, let's trade flickering screens for something musical. Some 1920s music machines that promise sweet tunes, but hit all the wrong notes. You're in a 1920s music shop, surrounded by polished wood cabinets and the faint jangle of a nearby phonograph. On the counter sits a contraption that looks like a gramophone on a bad day. Gears poking out, a horn the size of a tuba, and a crank you're supposed to turn for automatic music. It's called the Melody Master, and it promises to play any tune you want without a record. You give the crank a spin, and it wheezes like an asthmatic accordion. Welcome to the quirky world of 1920s mechanical music makers, where inventors tried to reinvent how you listen to jazz or ragtime. Most of these gadgets, though, played more clunks than chords. The 1920s were a musical revolution. A mainstream fact, the decade saw phonograph sales soar, with over 2 million units sold in the U.S. by 1929, making recorded music a household staple. But here's the quirky tidbit. Some inventors thought they could outdo records with machines like the automatic orchestrion, a 1924 device meant to mimic an entire band. You'd load it with punched caper rolls and it would pump out tunes via pipes and drums. Problem was, it sounded like a robot trying to yodel, and the rolls tore faster than a flapper's stockings. Historians still argue whether these machines failed because of their complexity or because records were just easier. The smart bet's on complexity. Those gears were a nightmare. You're cranking the Melody Master now, hoping for a snappy jazz tune. Instead, you get a grinding noise and a note that sounds like a cat stepped on a piano key. The shop clerk's insisting it just needs fine-tuning, but you're pretty sure it needs a miracle. Here's a chuckle. The manual claimed it could play any song in the world. Sure, if your world only has 3 off-key notes. You're half expecting the thing to start smoking, like that electric dish dryer we abandoned. Picture yourself at a 1920s music expo, booths filled with clattering contraptions. There's another flop, the Electro Tune Box, a device that promised to generate music with electric circuits. You flip its switch and it hums, then screeches like a radio stuck between stations. You're wincing, wondering who thought this was better than a Victrola. Call back to that televisor we squinted at. Same overzealous spirit here, just louder. The 1920s loved music, but these mechanical maestros couldn't keep up with the simplicity of spinning a record. As you step away from the Melody Master, your ears ringing, you're struck by the era's ambition. These inventors wanted to make music effortless and futuristic, but their machines were too finicky for the dance halls. Most ended up as dusty relics, overtaken by phonographs and radios. Now, let's leave the music shop and dive into something more hands-on, some 1920s home science kits that promised discovery but delivered more fumbles than breakthroughs. You're in a 1920s attic, the air dusty and lit by a single flickering bulb. On a wobbly table sits a home chemist's wonder kit, a wooden box stuffed with glass vials, metal tongs, and a booklet promising to turn you into a backyard Edison. You open it and the smell of chemicals stings your nose, sulfur maybe, or something worse. This is the 1920s world of DIY science kits, where inventors thought every kid, or overly curious adult, could unlock the secrets of the universe at home. Most of these kits, though, led to more spills and singed eyebrows than scientific glory. You're about to dive in and see why. The 1920s were a time of scientific fascination, with the public hungry for discovery. A mainstream fact, the decade saw breakthroughs like the discovery of Pluto in 1930, though it was still being debated in the late 1920s. But here's the quirky tidbit. Companies like the Porter Chemical Company sold Chemcraft kits, packed with real chemicals like sodium ferrocyanide, which you'd mix to create exciting reactions. The catch? Instructions were vague, and you'd often end up with a fizzing mess, or worse, a small explosion. Historians still argue whether these kits inspired future scientists or just endangered kids. Probably a bit of both, but the burns were real. You're cracking open the Wonder Kit now, pulling out a vial labeled Mystery Powder. The booklet tells you to mix it with another chemical for a dazzling glow. You pour carefully, but the mixture bubbles like an angry soda, spilling over the table. You're half expecting to summon a mad scientist instead of a light show. Here's a chuckle. The kit's slogan was "Safe for all ages." Sure, if you think a 10-year-old handling potassium nitrate is a great idea. You're starting to understand why your mom hid this thing in the attic. Picture yourself at a 1920s toy store, shelves lined with these science kits promising hours of educational fun. There's another flop, the Electrochem set, which included a tiny battery to spark reactions. You hook it up and the wires heat up, melting your test tube instead of creating crystals. You're dodging sparks, wondering who thought this was safer than a chemistry book. Call back to that Melody Master we cranked. Same overblown promises here, just with more risk of setting the house on fire. The 1920s loved the idea of democratizing science, but these kits were often more chaotic than enlightening. As you wipe the spilled powder off your hands, you're struck by the era's boundless curiosity. These kits were sold with dreams of turning kids into Einsteins, but most just taught them how to clean up a mess. They faded as safer toys and better regulations came along. Now, let's trade the attic for a 1920s switchboard, where communication gadgets are trying and failing to connect the world in weird new ways. You're hunched over a cluttered desk in a 1920s telegraph office, the air buzzing with the click-clack of Morse code. In front of you is a gadget that looks like a telephone had a bad date with a typewriter, the Telewriter, a device that promises to send handwritten notes over wires. You scribble a message, press a button, and the machine groans like it's digesting a bad meal. Welcome to the peculiar world of 1920s communication devices, where inventors tried to make talking or writing across distances faster and fancier. Most of these contraptions, though, ended up sending more confusion than clarity. The 1920s were a turning point for communication. A mainstream fact, the telephone was booming, with over 13 million phones in U.S. homes by 1929, connecting people like never before. But here's the quirky tidbit. Inventors pushed oddities like the phototelegraph, a 1924 device meant to transmit pictures over phone lines. You'd feed in a photo and it would scan it, slowly, into a grainy mess that took hours to send. The result? A blurry smudge that looked like your picture had been sneezed on. Historians still argue whether these devices flopped because of technical limits or because telegrams were just more practical. The tech was the bigger hurdle. Those early scanners were glacial. You're fiddling with the Telewriter now, trying to send a note to your cousin in Chicago. You write, "Hello, how's the weather?" and watch as the machine's stylus jerks across a paper roll, producing something closer to hieroglyphs than handwriting. The operator's muttering about calibration, but you're pretty sure this thing's better at eating ink than sending messages. Here's a chuckle. Ads claimed it would replace letters forever. Sure, if you wanted every note to look like a toddler's doodle. You're starting to miss the simplicity of a phone call. Picture yourself at a 1920s tech fair, booths showcasing communication gadgets. There's another flop, the voice printer, which promised to turn your spoken words into typed text. You speak into its oversized mouthpiece, testing 1, 2, and it spits out a ribbon of gibberish, like tasting 1, 2. You're laughing, but the inventor's not. Call back to that home chemist's wonder kit we spilled in the attic. Same ambitious vibe here, just with more crossed wires. The 1920s were obsessed with speeding up connection, but these devices were too clunky to keep up with phones and telegrams. As you abandon the Telewriter, its stylus still twitching, you're struck by the era's hunger for instant contact. These inventors dreamed of a world where words and images flew effortlessly, but their machines stumbled. Most faded into obscurity, outpaced by simpler, reliable tech. Now let's step out of the telegraph office and into a 1920s workshop, where safety gadgets are trying and failing to keep you out of harm's way. You're in a 1920s workshop, the air heavy with the tang of oil and sawdust, surrounded by tools and half-built contraptions. On a workbench sits a device that looks like a bicycle helmet crossed with a bird cage, the safety head guard, meant to protect you from workplace mishaps. You strap it on and it wobbles, pinching your ears and blocking half your view. This is the curious world of 1920s safety inventions, where dreamers tried to shield you from life's hazards with gadgets that often caused more trouble than they prevented. You're about to test some real clunkers that never caught on. The 1920s were a time of growing industrial safety awareness. A mainstream fact, the U.S. passed early workplace safety laws like the 1920 amendments to factory inspections, reducing accidents in mills and mines. But here's the quirky tidbit. Inventors churned out oddities like the anti-slip shoe grip, a 1926 device you'd strap to your boots to avoid slipping on wet floors. It was a metal plate with spikes, great until you walked on wood and got stuck like a fly on paper. Historians still argue whether these safety gadgets failed because of impractical designs or because workers just ignored them. Most agree the designs were the problem. Spikes don't scream user-friendly. You're trying the safety head guard now, ducking under a low beam in the workshop. The thing's so heavy your neck aches, and when you bump a shelf, it tilts, covering one eye like a pirate's patch. The inventor swears it'll save you from falling tools, but you're more worried about tripping over your own feet. Here's a chuckle. The manual suggested wearing it all day for total protection. Sure, if you want to look like a bobblehead and feel like you're lugging an anvil. You're starting to think a hard hat would have been smarter. Picture yourself at a 1920s safety expo, booths packed with earnest inventors. There's another flop, the fireproof apron, meant to shield factory workers from sparks. It was coated with asbestos. Yep, that asbestos, and weighed a ton. You try it on, and it's like wearing a lead blanket. Plus, it cracks when you bend. You're sweating, wondering who thought this was better than stepping away from the forge. Call back to that telewriter we scribbled with. Same overzealous spirit here, just heavier. The 1920s wanted to keep you safe, but these gadgets often made work harder than the hazards they aimed to fix. As you ditch the head guard, your head grateful for freedom, you're struck by the era's good intentions. These inventors saw danger everywhere and tried to armor you against it, but their solutions were clumsy or outright risky. Most vanished as simpler safety measures, like goggles and gloves, took over. Now, let's leave the workshop and slip into something more stylish, some 1920s fashion tech that promised flair but faded fast.
You're strutting through a 1920s boutique, the air scented with rosewater and the rustle of silk. A tailor hands you a pair of glow-tone trousers, which promise to light up your evening, literally, with tiny bulbs sewn into the seams. You slip them on, and they flicker like a Christmas tree with a bad fuse, making you look less dapper and more like a walking carnival sign. Welcome to the quirky world of 1920s fashion tech, where inventors tried to blend style with cutting-edge gadgets. Most of these outfits, though, were more likely to spark laughter than trends, fading faster than last season's hemline. The 1920s were a fashion revolution, with flapper style redefining chic. A mainstream fact, the decade saw women's clothing sales soar, with department stores like Macy's raking in millions by 1927 as dresses got shorter and bolder. But here's the quirky tidbit. Some inventors pushed smart clothing, like the electric necktie, a 1925 creation with a battery-powered bulb that glowed at the knot. You'd wear it to a dance, hoping to dazzle, but the battery pack in your pocket weighed as much as a brick, and the bulb often scorched the fabric. Historians still argue whether these fashion gadgets flopped due to impracticality or because they looked ridiculous. The smart money's on both. Nobody wants a tie that doubles as a fire hazard. You're adjusting the glow-tone trousers now, their dim bulbs casting a faint halo on the shop floor. The tailor's raving about futuristic elegance, but you're tripping over the wires trailing to a battery strapped to your belt. Here's a chuckle. The ad claimed they'd light up any party. Sure, if the party needed a human lamppost who smells faintly of burnt wool. You're starting to think a plain suit might have been the better call. Picture yourself flipping through a 1920s fashion catalog, pages touting gadgets like the vibrating shoe insoles, meant to stimulate circulation while you walked. You slip them in, and they buzz, making every step feel like you're walking on a hive of sleepy bees. The effect? Less health boost, more accidental jitterbug. Call back to that safety head guard we wrestled with. Same overzealous vibe here, just shinier. The 1920s loved blending tech with style, but these inventions were too clunky to strut down Main Street. As you peel off the trousers, relieved to avoid a short circuit, you're struck by the era's bold flair. These inventors wanted to make you a walking showcase of progress, but their gadgets were more gimmick than glamour. Most vanished as fashion stuck to simpler trends like beads and bobs. Now let's trade the boutique for a grander vision, some 1920s city plans that promised utopias but stayed on the drafting board.
You're strolling through a 1920s architect's office, blueprints scattered across a desk, each one sketching a city that looks like it belongs in a sci-fi novel. Skyscrapers spiral into the clouds, monorails weave between them, and parks float on platforms. This is the city of tomorrow, a utopian vision pitched by dreamers who thought the 1920s could rebuild the world from scratch. You pick up a plan labeled Aero City, and it promises homes with rooftop landing pads for personal airships. Spoiler, you're not moving in anytime soon. These grand urban designs never left the paper they were drawn on. The 1920s were a boom time for urban planning, a mainstream fact. Cities like New York saw massive growth, with the Chrysler Building starting construction in 1928, symbolizing the era's sky-high ambitions. But here's the quirky tidbit. Visionaries like architect Hugh Ferris proposed zoned cities where every building was sculpted to maximize sunlight and air, with terraced towers and elevated walkways. You'd walk through a metropolis of tiered skyscrapers, but the plans were so complex and costly they stayed sketches. Historians still argue whether these utopian dreams failed because of impractical engineering or because cities couldn't afford to start over. Cost was the bigger hurdle. Rebuilding a city isn't cheap. You're tracing the Aero City blueprint now, imagining yourself on a rooftop, waiting for an airship that never arrives. The design shows streets replaced by canals for aeroboats, but you're picturing the traffic jams, flying fenders everywhere. The architect's notes promise a city without congestion, but you're skeptical. Here's a chuckle. One plan suggested sky elevators to whisk you to penthouses. Sure, if you trust a cable to haul you 50 stories in a windstorm. You're starting to think your cramped apartment's not so bad. Picture yourself at a 1920s urban planning expo, models of futuristic cities gleaming under lights. There's another flop, the Radial City, a circular metropolis with a central hub for flying cars. Remember those clunkers we tested? You walk its model streets, but the layout ignores pesky realities like rivers or budgets. Call back to those glow-tone trousers we ditched. Same grandiose vibe here, just on a citywide scale. The 1920s loved imagining perfect cities, but these plans were too wild for mayors or wildest. As you set down the blueprint, you're struck by the era's soaring optimism. These architects saw cities as canvases for progress, but their visions outran reality. Most plans gathered dust, outshined by practical projects like bridges and subways. Now, let's shrink the scale and get cozy. Some 1920s pet gadgets that promised to pamper your pooch but ended up in the doghouse. You're kneeling in a 1920s pet shop, the air filled with the yips of puppies and the faint scent of sawdust. On a shelf sits a contraption labeled the Canine Comfort Collar, a clunky device with tiny springs and a battery, meant to keep your dog cozy and calm. You strap it onto a wagging terrier and it buzzes faintly, making the pup tilt its head like it's hearing a ghost. Welcome to the peculiar world of 1920s pet gadgets, where inventors tried to spoil your furry friends with tech that sounded great but worked about as well as a cat in a rainstorm. These devices were meant to revolutionize pet care, but most ended up as chew toys. The 1920s saw pets become bigger parts of family life. A mainstream fact, by 1929, the U.S. pet food industry was booming, with brands like Kennel Ration selling canned dog food for millions. But here's the quirky tidbit. Inventors pushed gadgets like the automatic dog washer, a 1926 tub with motorized brushes that promised to scrub your pup spotless. You'd lure Fido in, turn it on, and watch him bolt as the brushes spun like a car wash gone rogue, spraying soap everywhere. Historians still argue whether these pet gadgets flopped because of bad design or because animals hated them. The vote's on both. Dogs don't trust spinning brushes. You're trying the Canine Comfort Collar now, adjusting its straps as the terrier squirms. The idea is that gentle vibrations soothe your pet, but the buzzing just makes him nip at the collar like it's a pesky flea. The shop clerk swears it's scientifically calming, but you're pretty sure it's just annoying. Here's a chuckle. The manual suggested it could train your dog to sleep. Sure, if you count chasing its tail until it collapses as sleeping. You're starting to think a belly rub would work better. Picture yourself at a 1920s pet expo, booths packed with shiny animal gadgets. There's another flop, the Electro Pet Feeder, a timed dispenser for kibble. You set it up and it's supposed to drop food at noon, but instead it jams or dumps the whole bag, leaving your dog in a kibble avalanche. You try it and the mechanism clunks, startling the terrier into hiding. Call back to that Aero City we strolled through. Same overblown promises here, just furrier. The 1920s loved pampering pets, but these gadgets were too finicky for Fido. As you unclip the collar, the terrier shaking it off with a grateful yip, you're struck by the era's enthusiasm. Inventors thought tech could make pet care effortless, but animals had other plans. Most of these gadgets ended up in closets, outdone by a simple leash or bowl. Now, let's step back and reflect on why all these 1920s inventions, from collars to cities, quietly vanished into history's attic. You're sitting on a creaky porch swing, the 1920s fading like a dream as dusk settles over a quiet town. Around you, the ghosts of those wild inventions we've explored, flying cars, buzzing collars, flickering TVs, seem to hum in the air, each one a spark of hope that burned out too soon. You're holding a tattered 1929 magazine, its pages filled with ads for gadgets that promised to change the world but ended up forgotten. This is the final stop on our journey, where we unravel why these 1920s creations vanished and what their brief lives tell us about a decade drunk on possibility. The 1920s were a crucible of innovation. A mainstream fact, the decade's economic boom, with U.S. GDP growing over 40% from 1922 to 1929, fueled a surge in patents, nearly 450,000 filed. But here's the quirky tidbit. Many inventions, like the self-tipping hat, a 1927 device with a spring to lift your cat politely, were more novelty than necessity. You'd press a lever and your hat would bob, charming until the spring snapped and whacked your forehead. Historians still argue whether these flops failed because they were impractical or because the Great Depression crushed the market in 1929. Both played a part, but overselling was the real killer. Too many gadgets promised miracles they couldn't deliver. You're flipping through the magazine now, chuckling at an ad for that canine comfort collar we wrestled with. It boasts unmatched pet bliss, but you know it just annoyed poor Fido. The pattern's clear. Inventors of the 1920s were dreamers, riding a wave of post-war optimism and new tech like electricity. Call back to that buzzing workshop from the start. Every gadget we've touched, from the permawave machine to the Aero City, was born in that same frenzy. But ambition outran reality. You're picturing those inventors, sketching late into the night, convinced their idea would be the next radio. Most weren't. Here's a chuckle. One magazine calls these flops the future stepping stones. Stepping stones, maybe, but you'd still trip over them. Picture yourself wandering a 1920s junkyard, surrounded by rusting relics, spiked shoe grips, clanky orchestroyons, glowing trousers. Each one tells a story of hope, hustle, and a misstep. The Depression didn't help, drying up cash for risky ventures, but many failed earlier, too complex or just plain silly. You're starting to see why simpler tech, like toasters or phonographs, won out. They worked. These forgotten gadgets, though, paved the way, teaching engineers what not to do. As you close the magazine, you're struck by the era spirit, fearless, flawed, and a little absurd. Now let's ease you towards sleep, your mind heavy with the hum of those lost dreams. The porch sways gently, the night air cool against your skin. Those 1920s inventors with their sparking wires and wild blueprints fade into the stars, their voices softening to a whisper. You're drifting, the world slowing, as the clatter of gears becomes a distant lullaby. Imagine a quiet workshop, its tools still, bathed in moonlight. The gadgets we've met, robots, radios, flying cars, rest in the shadows, their stories told. You're safe here, wrapped in the glow of a decade that dared to dream big, even if it stumbled. Let your eyes grow heavy, your breath slow, and sink into the calm. The 1920s are gone, but their echoes carry you softly to sleep. Sweet dreams.